The gunshot echoed across the darkened green at Lexington just before dawn, sharp as a crack of lightning against the stillness of April 19, 1775. No one would ever know who pulled the trigger first. What mattered was that when the smoke lifted, the world had changed forever. In that single violent instant, the idea of America stopped being a dream whispered in taverns and became a reality baptized in blood. Men lay wounded on the cold ground, farmers, blacksmiths, fathers, citizens who only days before had plowed fields and kissed their children goodnight. Now they stared at the pale sky, realizing that the British Empire, the most powerful force on earth, had just been challenged by people who owned little more than muskets, stubborn pride, and an unshakable belief that no king had the right to rule them without their consent. This was not the beginning of America. It was the moment America decided it would rather die than kneel. A land before a nation. More than a century before that shot, long before the word American meant anything at all, the land itself had already been shaped by struggle. In 1607, the English settlers who stumbled ashore at Jamestown did not arrive as conquerors. They arrived hungry, frightened, and utterly unprepared. The rivers were unfamiliar, the summers suffocating, the winters cruel. Disease stalked them relentlessly. By their first year's end, more than half were dead. Survival depended on uneasy alliances with native nations who had lived on this land for thousands of years, people whose civilizations were complex, spiritual, and deeply tied to the earth. For a brief moment in history, two worlds stood side by side, each misunderstanding the other, each believing the land could still be theirs. That moment would not last. As colonies spread, Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, so did conflict. Land was taken through treaties written in foreign tongues and broken with alarming ease. Forests fell, rivers filled with ships. The old world's hunger crossed the ocean, and the new world bled to feed it. Yet even as injustice grew, so did something unexpected: self-rule. Colonists learned to govern themselves out of necessity. Town halls, colonial assemblies, local militias, these were not acts of rebellion at first, but habits, and habits, once formed, are hard to break. By the mid-1700s, the colonies were no longer children of Britain. They were adolescents, impatient and ambitious, and increasingly resentful of a distant father who demanded obedience but offered little understanding. The taxation that lit the fuse. The 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, ended in 1763, with Britain victorious and deeply in debt. Parliament looked west across the Atlantic and saw opportunity. Taxes followed. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act. Each one was small on paper. Each one was enormous in principle. The colonists did not object merely because they had to pay. They objected because they had no voice, no representation, no vote in the parliament that claimed authority over their lives. No taxation without representation, they cried, not as radicals, but as Englishmen defending what they believed were their inherited rights. Britain answered not with compromise, but with force. Red-coated soldiers marched into Boston. Cannons loomed over harbors. Homes were searched. Resistance hardened. On a cold night in March 1770, tensions snapped. British soldiers fired into a crowd. 5 colonists died in the snow-stained street. It would be called the Boston Massacre. The word massacre spread faster than the truth, but the truth no longer mattered. A line had been crossed, and both sides knew it. The men who dared to imagine. Revolutions are not born from anger alone. They are born when anger meets imagination.
Thomas Paine, a recent immigrant with little money and no status, picked up his pen and wrote Common Sense. In plain language, he argued something unthinkable, that a king was unnecessary, that an island should not rule a continent, that ordinary people could govern themselves. The pamphlet spread like wildfire. Farmers read it by candlelight. Soldiers carried it in their packs. For the first time, independence felt not only possible, but inevitable. In Philadelphia, men gathered who knew exactly what they were risking. Thomas Jefferson, quiet and brilliant, drafted words that would echo across centuries. John Adams argued fiercely for independence, knowing it could cost him everything. Benjamin Franklin, old, worldly, and shrewd, understood that ideas alone would not win wars. On July 4, 1776, they signed their names beneath a declaration that accused their king of tyranny and claimed that all men are created equal. They were committing treason. If they failed, they would hang. War against an empire. The Revolutionary War was not a heroic march from victory to victory. It was brutal, uncertain, and often desperate. George Washington's army was underfed, underpaid, and outmatched. Soldiers marched barefoot through snow, leaving blood behind them at Valley Forge. Desertion was constant. Defeat was frequent. But Washington understood something the British did not: time. He did not need to win every battle. He needed to survive. Slowly, painfully, the war dragged on. The colonies endured because they had no alternative. Defeat meant submission. Victory meant everything. When France entered the war on America's side, the balance shifted. At Yorktown in 1781, British General Cornwallis surrendered. The impossible had happened. The colonies were free. A nation still unfinished. Independence did not bring unity, it brought questions. What kind of nation would this be? Who would have power? Who would be left out? The Constitution was a compromise forged from fear as much as hope. It balanced liberty with order, democracy with restraint. It was brilliant and deeply flawed. Enslaved people were counted as fractions of humans. Women were excluded entirely. Native Americans were ignored as sovereign peoples. The Republic was born, but it was not yet just. And history, relentless and unforgiving, was only getting started.
The war had ended, but peace did not arrive with it. When the last British ships disappeared over the horizon, America stood alone, free, victorious, and dangerously uncertain of what it had just become. 13 former colonies, bound together by war, now faced a question far more difficult than defeating an empire. Could they survive themselves? There was no king to command, no empire to enforce unity, only states, jealous of their power, suspicious of one another, and terrified of tyranny in any form. The Articles of Confederation, America's first governing framework, reflected that fear. The national government was weak by design. It could not tax, it could not regulate trade, it could not compel states to act. Liberty was protected, but stability was sacrificed. Very quickly, cracks began to show. A nation on the edge of collapse. By the mid-1780s, the Revolutionary War's promises had turned bitter for many who had fought it. Veterans returned home unpaid, their land seized for unpaid debts. Farmers watched prices collapse while taxes rose. In Massachusetts, desperation erupted into open rebellion. Daniel Shays, a former Continental Army officer, led armed farmers against courthouses that symbolized a system no longer serving them. They were not radicals, they were patriots who believed the revolution had betrayed them. When state militias struggled to suppress the uprising, America's leaders panicked. If a republic could not maintain order, if its own soldiers turned against it, then perhaps the critics were right.
Perhaps people could not govern themselves. George Washington, who had hoped to retire quietly to Mount Vernon, watched events unfold with growing alarm. Reluctantly, he returned to public life, convinced that the nation stood at a crossroads. The constitutional gamble. In the summer of 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia. Officially, they were there to revise the Articles of Confederation. In reality, they planned to replace them entirely. The Constitutional Convention was held in secrecy. Windows were shut. Guards stood watch. The men inside argued fiercely, sometimes angrily, about the very nature of power. Large states demanded representation by population. Small states demanded equality. Southern states demanded protections for slavery. Every compromise left scars. James Madison, brilliant and relentless, shaped the framework of a government divided into branches: executive, legislative, judicial, each designed to restrain the others. Power would exist, but it would never rest in one's hands. The Constitution that emerged was not perfect. It was pragmatic, it was cautious, and it was an extraordinary gamble. Ratification was far from guaranteed. Across the states, debates raged. Supporters called themselves Federalists. Opponents warned that the new government would become as tyrannical as the British Crown. Only when the promise of a Bill of Rights, explicit protections for individual liberty, was added did the Constitution survive. In 1789, George Washington became the first president of the United States. The experiment had begun. The shadow of slavery. Even as the Republic took shape, a contradiction lay at its heart, one so deep that it would eventually tear the nation apart: slavery. The Revolution had spoken of liberty and equality, yet nearly 1/5 of the population remained enslaved. In the North, gradual emancipation began. In the South, slavery tightened its grip, fueled by the invention of the cotton gin and global demand for profit. Plantations expanded, families were torn apart, chains replaced hope. America grew wealthier and more divided. Leaders knew the issue could not be ignored forever, but they feared it too much to confront it directly. Again and again, compromise postponed the inevitable. Each delay made the reckoning bloodier. The rise of political warfare. Washington's presidency brought stability, but unity was already fracturing. Alexander Hamilton envisioned a strong federal government, national banks, and industrial growth. Thomas Jefferson feared centralized power and championed agrarian democracy and states' rights. Their rivalry created America's first political parties. Politics became warfare by pen, speech, and influence. Newspapers attacked leaders viciously. Accusations of treason were common. The peaceful transfer of power, something never before attempted, was untested. When Jefferson defeated Adams in the election of 1800, the world watched closely. The transition occurred without violence. For the first time in history, power changed hands peacefully in a republic. The experiment survived another test. Expansion and destiny. As the nation stabilized, it looked west. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled America's size overnight. Jefferson himself doubted its constitutionality, but opportunity outweighed caution. Pioneers followed rivers and trails into lands already inhabited by native nations. Treaties were signed, broken, rewritten, and ignored. Forced removals followed. Under Andrew Jackson, the policy became explicit. The Trail of Tears carried thousands of Native Americans to their deaths as they were driven from ancestral lands to satisfy white expansion. America grew stronger, America grew richer, America grew crueler. America grew stronger, America grew richer, America grew stronger, America grew richer, America grew crueler. America grew stronger, America grew richer, America grew crueler. America grew stronger, America grew richer, America grew crueler. America grew stronger, America grew richer, America grew crueler. America grew stronger, America grew richer, America grew crueler. a union strained to the breaking point. By the 1840s and 1850s, every new territory reopened the same explosive question: free state or slave state? The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, each was a temporary bandage on a widening wound. Violence erupted in Kansas. Politicians brawled on the floor of Congress. One senator was beaten nearly to death with a cane for speaking against slavery. The language of compromise faded. The language of absolutes replaced it. When Abraham Lincoln, a man who opposed the expansion of slavery, was elected president in 1860, Southern states chose secession over submission. The Union shattered. The war that redefined America. In April 1861, Confederate guns fired on Fort Sumter. The war began. It would become the deadliest conflict in American history. Brother fought brother, entire cities burned, fields turned red. Lincoln struggled beneath the unbearable weight of command, aging visibly as the death toll rose. The war was not only about preserving the Union, it became a moral crusade. With the Emancipation Proclamation, the war transformed. Freedom became a weapon. Enslaved people fled plantations, joined Union lines, and claimed their humanity. In 1865, after 4 years of unimaginable sacrifice, the Confederacy collapsed. The Union was preserved. Slavery was abolished. And Abraham Lincoln was assassinated days later.
The war was over, but peace proved far more elusive than victory. When the guns finally fell silent in 1865, the United States stood transformed and traumatized. More than 600,000 were dead. Cities lay in ruins. Families were shattered beyond repair. 4 million formerly enslaved people stepped into freedom with nothing but hope and uncertainty. The Union had survived. But the question that now haunted America was simple and terrifying. What would freedom actually mean? Reconstruction, a second revolution. For a brief moment, history opened a narrow door toward justice. The Reconstruction Amendments reshaped the Constitution. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment promised equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment guaranteed voting rights regardless of race. Black Americans voted. They held public office. Schools opened. Churches became centers of political and social life. The South, battered and humbled, was forced to confront a radically new order. But this revolution had enemies. Former Confederates resented defeat. Many white Americans, North and South, feared true equality more than they valued justice. Violence returned, quieter but relentless. The Ku Klux Klan rose in the shadows, using terror to reclaim dominance. Lynchings replaced chains. Intimidation replaced law. When federal troops withdrew in 1877, Reconstruction collapsed. Freedom remained on paper. In reality, America had betrayed its promise. The age of steel and smoke. As the South sank into segregation, the North surged forward into an age of astonishing transformation. Railroads stitched the continent together. Steel replaced wood. Oil replaced muscle. Factories roared day and night, swallowing immigrants by the millions. Names became legends. Andrew Carnegie, Steel King. John D. Rockefeller, Oil Baron. J.P. Morgan, Financial Titan. They built empires that reshaped the economy and concentrated wealth on a scale never before seen. For some, America became a land of unimaginable opportunity. For many more, it became a grind of endless labor.
Men, women, and children worked dangerous jobs for meager wages. Slums expanded. Strikes erupted. Workers demanded dignity. The government usually answered with force. At Haymarket, at Homestead, at Pullman. The republic built on liberty now faced a new question. Could democracy survive extreme inequality? The closing of the frontier. By 1890, the Census Bureau declared the American frontier closed. For generations, the frontier had been more than land. It had been an idea, a place where people could start over, where failure was not final. Now it was gone. Native nations had been crushed, confined to reservations after wars marked by betrayal and brutality. The buffalo were nearly extinct. The West had been claimed. With nowhere left to expand, America turned inward and outward. An empire in denial. In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain. The conflict was brief, decisive, and transformative. America emerged with overseas territories, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. The nation that once rebelled against empire now possessed one of its own. Leaders insisted it was not imperialism. They spoke of duty, civilization, and progress. But Filipinos who resisted American rule were met with brutal suppression. The contradiction deepened. America preached self-determination while denying it to others. The progressive response. At the turn of the century, reformers pushed back. Journalists exposed corruption and child labor. Activists fought for women's suffrage. Politicians challenged monopolies. Theodore Roosevelt, larger than life, embodied the moment. He confronted corporate power, protected natural resources, and redefined the presidency as a force for moral leadership. In 1920, women finally won the right to vote. Progress was slow, uneven, hard-won. But the republic bent, if not always toward justice, then at least toward reform. War to end all wars. In 1917, America entered World War I. Young men crossed the Atlantic to fight in trenches that redefined horror. Modern warfare shattered illusions of glory. Machine guns, poison gas, and mass death left scars that would never fully heal. When the war ended, America emerged richer, stronger, and deeply disillusioned. President Woodrow Wilson envisioned a world remade by democracy and international cooperation. The Senate rejected his vision. The United States turned inward once more. The Roaring Twenties and the crash. Prosperity exploded in the 1920s. Jazz filled the air. Skyscrapers pierced the sky. Stock prices soared beyond reason. But beneath the celebration, the economy was fragile, built on speculation and debt. In October 1929, the illusion collapsed. The stock market crashed. Banks failed. Jobs vanished. Breadlines stretched for blocks. Families lost everything. The American dream lay in ruins. The New Deal. Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office in 1933 as the nation teetered on the brink. With calm resolve and bold experimentation, he reshaped the relationship between government and people. Programs put millions to work. Banks were stabilized. Hope returned, slowly, painfully. The New Deal did not end the Great Depression by itself, but it restored faith that democracy could respond to crisis. As the decade closed, a darker storm gathered overseas. Totalitarian regimes rose in Europe and Asia. The world edged toward another war. America hesitated, scarred by the last one. History, however, does not wait. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the illusion of distance died. Across the Pacific, Japanese aircraft roared over Pearl Harbor, turning battleships into burning wrecks and the calm Hawaiian sky into chaos. Sailors drowned in oil-choked water. Bombs fell with terrifying precision. By the time the smoke cleared, more than 2,400 Americans were dead. The United States had been dragged into a war it had tried desperately to avoid. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress. His voice was steady, but his words carried fire. A date which will live in infamy. America declared war, and the Republic changed forever. A nation remade for war. World War II demanded everything. Factories that once made cars now produced tanks. Women flooded industrial jobs, becoming Rosie the Riveter, redefining gender roles with grease-stained hands and quiet determination. Farmers fed armies. Scientists raced against time. The economy surged. Unemployment vanished. The Great Depression ended not with celebration, but with sacrifice. Yet even in unity, injustice thrived. More than 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them citizens, were stripped of their rights and imprisoned in internment camps, their loyalty questioned solely because of their ancestry. Fear had overridden liberty. Again, the war abroad. American forces fought across continents. In Europe, they landed on the beaches of Normandy under relentless fire. Young men stormed cliffs knowing many would never return. Paris was liberated. Nazi camps were uncovered, revealing industrialized murder on a scale that stunned the world. In the Pacific, the war was brutal beyond imagination. Island by island, Marines fought an enemy that rarely surrendered. Casualties mounted. Victory came at a terrifying cost. As the war dragged on, a secret project reached its climax, the Manhattan Project. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb obliterated Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. Japan surrendered. World War II ended. The United States emerged not just victorious, but transformed into a superpower capable of destroying the world. The Cold War began. Peace brought no calm. Almost immediately, America found itself locked in an ideological struggle with its former ally, the Soviet Union. Democracy faced communism. Capitalism faced collectivism. The Cold War was not fought primarily with armies, but with fear. Nuclear weapons multiplied. Missiles stood ready. Children practiced duck and cover drills. The possibility of annihilation became a constant presence. Abroad, proxy wars erupted. In Korea, Americans fought to a stalemate. In Vietnam, the conflict dragged on, claiming lives and shattering trust in government. At home, paranoia flourished. Senator Joseph McCarthy accused Americans of communist sympathies with little evidence. Careers were destroyed. Freedom of thought narrowed. The nation once founded on dissent now feared it. The moral reckoning. While America claimed leadership of the free world, it confronted an undeniable truth within its borders. Segregation endured. Black Americans who had fought and died for democracy abroad returned to second-class citizenship at home. Jim Crow laws ruled the South. Violence enforced silence. But silence did not last. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. The Montgomery bus boycott followed, led by a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr., whose voice would come to define a movement. He spoke not of revenge, but of justice, not of hatred, but of hope. Children faced fire hoses, protesters endured beatings, churches were bombed. The nation watched. Some turned away, others could not. The law catches up to morality. Change came slowly, but it came. The Supreme Court struck down segregation in schools. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Legal equality was no longer a promise, it was law. Yet progress came at a cost. In 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Riots erupted. Faith in peaceful change trembled. At the same time, the Vietnam War deepened. College campuses erupted in protest. Trust between citizens and government fractured. In 1969, as division spread on Earth, Americans watched something extraordinary. A man walked on the moon. For a moment, the nation remembered what unity could achieve. A shaken confidence. The 1970s tested American faith. The Watergate scandal revealed corruption at the highest level of power. A president resigned in disgrace. The myth of unquestionable leadership collapsed. Economic shocks followed. Oil crises, inflation, stagnation. America seemed uncertain of itself. But uncertainty did not mean decline, it meant transition. The turn toward a new era. In the 1980s, the Cold War intensified once more before collapsing under its own contradictions. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union dissolved. Nuclear annihilation receded, temporarily, from fear to memory. The United States stood alone as the world's dominant power. The question returned, older than the nation itself. What would it do with that power? The Republic had survived war, depression, and division, but history had not finished with it.
When the Cold War ended, Americans believed history itself had exhaled. There was no rival superpower left to challenge the United States, no ideological enemy that could plausibly threaten democracy on a global scale. Politicians spoke of a peace dividend. Economists predicted endless growth. Many believed the long struggle of the 20th century had resolved itself at last. They were wrong. History does not end, it only changes its weapons. A world without balance. In the 1990s, the United States stood alone, militarily dominant, economically powerful, culturally influential beyond precedent. American movies, music, and technology reached every corner of the globe. The Internet shrank distances, dissolving borders in ways no empire had ever managed. Globalization promised prosperity. Factories moved overseas, corporations grew richer, consumers paid less, markets soared. But beneath the surface, fault lines widened. Entire American communities hollowed out as manufacturing vanished. Wages stagnated, inequality deepened. The benefits of globalization pooled at the top, while uncertainty spread below. Still, the nation believed itself secure. Then came a morning that shattered that illusion. September 11th, 2001. The sky over New York was impossibly blue. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 slammed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. At first, it seemed like an accident. 18 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower. There was no confusion then. Smoke rose like a wound against the skyline. People ran through ash-filled streets. Thousands were trapped above the flames. Some chose to jump rather than burn. The Pentagon was hit. Another plane fell in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. Nearly 3,000 people were dead. America was at war, though it did not yet know with whom or how or where it would end.